All right, what's up, everybody? Today I have with me wife, mother, patriot, researcher, YouTuber. Her name is Lisa Logan, and I've been watching her videos all day today and looking at a lot of her information, and she's uncovered some really great stuff. It's a topic that we haven't talked about in a while on this channel, which is education. But we're not just talking about education, because a lot of this is going to overlap with things that you've heard me talk about over the years, like Tavistock, like the Frankfurt School, individuals that come out of these bodies of globalist arms, appendages, you could say, and they infiltrate in a very subversive way into education, into medicine, all across the board, government. And she's gone into depths of research that I haven't seen other people go into. So I'm glad to be joined today by Lisa Logan. How are you today?
I'm great, Jay. How are you? So happy to be here.
I'm good. I mean, I noticed a lot of what I hear in these characters. It's a lot of these sort of boring government bureaucrat people that most people aren't familiar with. But when you actually listen to them talk, we're going to find out that this is actually everything that we talk about on the 4th hour of Lord Voldemort's show, everything I've been talking about in my Global Elite book series. So let's start out with talking about the National Training Labs and where this idea of sensitivity training comes from, because people have been talking about, I think James Lindsay had a post where he talked about the CIA had declassified a document in 1974 that talked about how sensitivity training is used in Marxist regimes like like Communist China. And the 1974 CIA document said not to use it because it was actually, quote, dangerous. However, you pointed out that the real basis for sensitivity training had been done by some people that we've heard about on this channel for a long time. You want to discuss that?
Yeah, that's Kurt Luen. And, it's funny. I've been doing research for 3 years now on various aspects of education, and that's kind of led me to the UN and other places. But it was when I found this figure, Kurt Luen, it's like everything converged that I had been researching. So I had been researching the Inner Development Goals, which is terrible. It's basically the Sustainable Development Goals, but for you and you as a person. And it follows basically the 5 concept of social emotional learning. So people who are a part of that are involved with sensitivity training. It what eventually became organizational learning. And I kind of worked backwards from there, because you're like, well, where did organizational learning come from? And that's Kurt Luen. So Kurt Luen had, I guess one of his best friends was at the Frankfurt School. He studied just therapy. He was involved in a lot of stuff. And in fact, during World War II, he was involved in sensitivity training, specifically with spies that they would send out into the field. And the problem they had was that these spies would either completely turn around their ideology, easily brainwashed, or they would just become so, I guess in their terms, right, not resilient, right? They would be so in despair because they were by themselves that they would just, defect.
Well, now wait a minute. So I've got a question here: is why would sensitivity training be relevant to the spy world? Help us understand that.
Right. Well, again, I was talking about them just being lonely, right? When they get out into the field and they feel the sense of, I'm alone and I'm doing this. The sensitivity training was geared toward helping them feel a sense of camaraderie with the people they were doing it with. And the way that they do that through sensitivity training, much like they do through social emotional learning, is they have these soldiers share very sensitive information with each other. When you do that, when you kind of open up and you're vulnerable, there becomes a sense of community. This happens also in cults, right?
Right.
People open up and there's love bombing, and you feel a sense of closeness that rivals that of your family. And so these soldiers, because they had this sensitivity training, felt very bonded to each other, and they felt that they lasted longer in the field because of that.
Interesting. Yeah, and I remember when I was reading about Tavistock many years ago that they were also very, very obsessed with group learning, group dynamics, and how to really change individuals' thought processes through group inclusion. And I think you talked about, or one of the posts talked about T groups, and that they had really figured out ways to manipulate people to not have independent thinking. And I think that's a key pattern that we'll see throughout this. And do you want to tell us about what they discovered in regard to emotional triggers, and how this then kind of overlaps with change experiments?
Well, emotional triggers. Well, the T groups, they also called them encounter groups. And this actually became kind of a phenomenon, right? I know you've had lots of people on your show talk about Esalen and how they kind of use this whole idea to break open people's psychological weaknesses, right, and try to turn them into strengths. And so they do all these group exercises where you kind of have to give up your sense of autonomy, right? I think Courtney Turner has talked about how they had, when she's gone to these kinds of encounter group trainings, they have you hold hands and like sing a song. And so it's like, if you don't do what the group does, you're excluded, you're isolated, you feel a sense of otherness. And so they use this whole thing to supposedly, it was like the early kind of bubblings of DEI, right? So the T groups also were used by, after in Vietnam, when there was all those race wars, like in Kitty Hawk. And what they do, they send the soldiers back and do what they call T group or sensitivity group or encounter group training. And they would have some officer come in and be like, if you're white, you're racist.
Yeah.
And then they would see like how they would react, and they would have people planted within the group to like agree with them and just see if they could get them to comply with that similar mindset that everyone else had. And so it's been used so many different ways that it's kind of crazy. But I think going back to the National Training Laboratories, the thing that blew me away was I didn't even know this existed. And these National Training Laboratories were the ones doing this organizational learning and teaching people how to, they would come have them do the T groups and then train them on how to facilitate those themselves and then send them out. And two of the groups that were involved in putting this whole National Training Laboratory together was the National Education Association and the Office for Naval Academy Research. So that was who was providing the funding and who was involved with that. And so now you see that come full circle. Now how we see social emotional learning happening in education and helping students to have this group think and to be vulnerable and to kind of renounce the values of their families, to kind of adopt the values of the group that they're in at school. And it's crazy that it all kind of goes back to this one figure in Kurt Luen.
Well, speaking of overlaps with cults, I noticed as I was going through your videos, the recurring pattern of these sort of NGO type groups, or not even, or the government groups, I should say, the bureaucratic groups, that they continually want to sever the influence of the individual through education from the family. So, for example, later on, there's the health programs that allow college kids, and I'm assuming they're going to try to have that at high schools as well eventually, that you can get like, special health programs that don't require you to go to your parents for some sort of permission. So there's a constant attempt to sever the relationship between the family as a support and get them introduced to a new kind of family, which is their state cult or whatever this is. And that's a cult tactic, right? That's a cult tactic, right? The state cult. Yeah. It's like getting you involved in, and also that confession. I think if you think about like Skull and Bones, right? When people are introduced to Skull and Bones, they lay in a coffin, they go through this very bizarre hazing ritual process where they're peed on and they confess things. And people think that's weird, but it's actually similar to this in that it's like a breaking down process where you're humiliated, you confess all of your, worst sins or whatever. Now you're part of this group, they have dirt on you, now you're linked in this traumatic way. And so it's, again, just another pattern that I'm noticing. And this, again, as you pointed out, is going back to the 1940s. This is not like a Cold War thing. I mean, that's right at the beginning of the Cold War. So they were already studying this through these Frankfurt School connected figures like Kurt Luen out of Tavistock. And of course, we've covered Tavistock quite a bit. So I also noted that, as you pointed out in your videos, I don't mean to be rambling the whole time, but Next question would be, what is the, there was a image you put up that had OD, and I wasn't sure what OD was.
Organizational development.
Okay.
It's another
Okay.
word for organizational learning. So what we have to remember about Kurt Luen is that he went all over the place. He just didn't work for the military. He went to MIT
Yeah.
at some point. I think he did a stint at Stanford also. But he started a group there. I think it was called the Center for Group Dynamics Research or something like that. That ended up being eventually transferred to the University of Michigan after
Yes, Michigan. That's what. There's what's the National Institute of, I forget all the acronyms. I'm looking through the book here. Do you remember what it is? That there's another one that he's involved in that's like NST or NIS or something.
Oh, NEF. You're probably talking about the New Education Fellowship. So
Might be.
That's very interesting as well, because so the New Education Fellowship was started by a Quaker and a Theosophist, and they actually kind of brought together a bunch of, thinkers about, who would give presentations, and Kurt Luen was one of them.
Gotcha.
And they were actually a group that was and if you look it up in Wikipedia, it actually says it was a midwife to the birth of UNESCO. So they were actually, like, a lot of the people that were involved in the New Education Fellowship went on to be along with UNESCO as well. And I think they changed it to the World Education Fellowship at some point. And they're still an NGO connected to the UN, but they were really the group that started UNESCO.
Yeah, and that makes perfect sense with the theosophy realm as well. So I apologize, I cut you off there. I didn't mean to just deflect, but we were talking about OD, organizational development, and that's just another terminology. We're going to notice a lot of baggage and word salad that's used, but actually, when we drill into it, as you pointed out, before you got to it in one of your videos, I'd actually listed out all of the jargon. I'm like, they just, like, half of these videos of these bureaucrats is just them repeating the same jargon, and you could put it into a jargon generator and just have it spit out like an algorithm, right? And you could have them say, well, inclusive equity should include equality of outcome through sustainable, resilient openness for a transformative preference for BIPOC climate change individuals, and avoiding racism and creating a thriving health-based community. It's like, it's all that jargon right there in one sentence, right?
Yeah, it's funny. I have to sometimes kind of train myself to focus, because they do say so much word salad that I find myself kind of trailing off as I'm listening to them, because they just literally say nothing. I mean, they say like 100 words and say nothing in that.
And I thought you had a great point that really all the jargon is just code for a kind of insidious social credit control system is really all this means. So you just throw out all the jargon, it just equates to basically Fabian socialism.
Yeah, and I think the important thing that I've realized over time, you kind of start to synthesize your own message and figure out how to, kind of bring it to people, is pointing out that these nice words, that they sound nice to them, thriving, inclusive, flourishing. They use all these nice words, but really that just brings it back to, they want to control you. They want to install a totalitarian one world government, and that's basically the gist of it.
Well, and I remember one of the characters connected to Kurt Luen too. I forget his name, but there's another figure who was also writing a bunch of papers, I think at that Michigan institute that you're talking about, really pioneering a bunch of what would become the race relations stuff. Do you want to get into that, how this is really the birth of critical race theory too, which not many people know? So could you speak to that and how that kind of emerges from this Frankfurt School, these circles?
Yes. So this was the early, like, sensitivity training and doing these groups and talking about all this stuff we just were mentioning. I mean, really, this is the beginnings of anti-bias training. So there was a center, I can't remember the name of the organization, that actually approached Kurt Luen, because Kurt Luen already was kind of obsessed with race in general. What I read about him is that he was kind of, he was sympathetic to the Germans' cause during World War II, but then kind of almost felt a sense of betrayal that Hitler was going after Jews because he was a Jew. And so it always kind of left him feeling like really unsettled about race in general, and he was really interested in race, and he wrote about it all the time. But this group had approached him, and they wanted him to come up with the training. And this is actually the birth of sensitivity training. Is they're like, hey, can you come up with some training that we can do to kind of help race relations? And so he basically came up with the beginnings of what they call anti-bias training, right? Where we examine our unconscious bias. You hear that all the time in social emotional learning. So they're going to have unconscious bias training, where we're going to say, well, just because you're white and you benefit from the privileges of having more power and privilege than someone who is a person of color, you automatically, though you don't know it, want to keep that system in place. And so this is kind of like the beginnings of all of that.
Perfect. Now, if you could, for my audience, I know probably most of the audience has heard these terms, but just a couple of the basic terms that are repeated all the time. What exactly is your understanding of, quote, critical race theory? What does that mean?
For me, going back to organizational development and organizational learning, they want people to see the system as a whole and what their role is in it, right? So you're either an oppressor or you're an oppressed. And then beyond seeing just your role, your identity in that system, they want you to see what you're supposed to do. So if you're an oppressed, right, you need to speak the truth, you need to rally. If you're a white person, you need to tear down the systems of America and make them not systemically racist anymore. So I think for me, that's critical race theory. It's getting people to be critical of the system that already exists, the institutions and structures that already exist in society, and then realize their role in tearing that down.
So you accept your role as oppressor and oppressed, and then act accordingly, basically.
Right.
Okay, and what is intersectionality, this term we hear all the time?
Well, that's kind of combining, levels of power and privilege, right? So for instance, if you're a white male, you're more privileged than a white female. Right?
So this is the oppression totem. This is the oppression totem pole, basically.
Mm-hmm. Right. So intersectionality is like if you're Black and you're female and you're queer, that is like the quintessence of oppression.
But what if you're also a midget and all those? That's even more elite, right? So it's like a weird version of elitism.
And if you're an unhoused midget,
and you only have one leg and no other limbs, right? Yes. But then you could wear an eye patch and be better than the other one. Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, it's a weird inverted sort of like, I don't know, Olympics or something. Okay, so that's intersectionality. And now, what about a couple other terms, and we'll get back to the videos. We hear this all the time too. DEI. What DEI? I think we've heard in regard to like social credit scores and the corporate Fortune 500, Fortune 100. They're pushing, quote, DEI. How does DEI relate to this older Frankfurt School, Kurt Luen, Tavistock stuff?
I prefer DIE because it's just
okay. Yeah.
Because it's terrible. It's diversity, equity, inclusion, and it's just saying that we need to prioritize diversity over merit is really what it is. So they're saying if you have these intersectional identities, that you should have preferential treatment. And so on top of that, right, that's why they're hiring all these consultants to come into these companies and say, oh, you need training on what it means to be diverse. And that's where they bring in the sensitivity training and tell everyone that they're racist.
So basically, this is where you're getting the, these outside people coming in and saying, you need to hire, minority CEOs. You're not allowing equity in terms of the stock, the board, the company board, and the HR department, and presumably other departments where actual qualification and knowledge might be important. Like, I don't know, running the freaking water plant or something, right? Like, you see what I'm saying? Like, actual infrastructure might be affected in this.
Oh, 100%. I mean, you're seeing that happen in the airline industry right now.
Exactly. Yeah, that's where I was going.